Okay, hi everyone. Good morning, well, my time, from Perth, and welcome to our last 2024 meeting of the Australian Sensitive Data Interest Group, affectionately known as AUSDIG, if you're new to the group. Today we are going to have a fantastic presentation from the Australian Dataspaces team at the ARDC, talking about their initiative to improve data sharing. Before we begin, I would like to, as always, do an acknowledgement of country. And I would really like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet. For me, that's the people of the Dharmawardena Nation here in the West. And I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. So you've probably noticed that today's meeting is being recorded. I'm only going to record the presentation at the start. I'm not going to record the discussion afterwards, and the roundtable in the second hour won't be recorded either. That's just so that you can freely ask questions without thinking, oh, it's going to appear on YouTube or anything like that. So if you don't want to appear on the video recording, perhaps turn off your camera if you would prefer. Okay, for those of you who aren't members of AUSDIG, you are very, very welcome to join our mailing list. You're not going to get spammed. It's really only messages relating to these monthly meetings and occasionally other sensitive data news, or we had a post the other week about a data stewardship award that I thought may be of interest to our members. So by all means, use that QR code to sign up. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the team to talk about the Australian Dataspaces initiative. So the first hour, they'll be talking about their initiative, and the second hour will still be in the same Zoom session, and they will be running a roundtable discussion, which sounds super interesting. So I will stop sharing and hand over to the team.
Thanks, Kylie. Just in the absence of Kheeran, oh no, Kheeran's here, great.
Hi, Shannon, thanks. Sorry, I was having a little bit of trouble with connecting to the network, so hopefully that's all coming all right. Mohammed, could you share the slides instead of me, just in case my network drops out?
Yeah, sure, Caroline. My slides, so I'll start sharing.
So while Mohammed's getting that, so thank you, Kylie, for this opportunity to talk to this group. We're quite excited to have this chat, and I think it's a really useful one. So I'd like it to be as interactive as it can be. All right. So I'm Kheeran, and I'm leading the Dataspaces initiative for ARDC. If you want to go to the next slide, Mohammed. And this is the team. So I lead the Dataspaces program. We've got Shannon, Mohammed, John, Andy, and Rob as part of this team. Quite a few of us will be talking, and I'll probably be the one who's talking the least in here. But the Dataspaces program was launched at the middle of the year, and it's really trying to bring the Dataspaces concept into Australia, and we'll explain what it's all about. If you want to go to the next slide, Mohammed. So the agenda for this session is we'll spend some time explaining what Dataspaces is, what its architecture is. Shannon will start off with what Dataspaces is, its history, and how it came about and why we're interested in it. I'll cover John will run through the architecture side of it, and Mohammed will run through the Dataspaces and how it complements the research, trusted research environment space, which I think this group will be quite familiar with. And I'll wrap up at the end with what the program is and what we're trying to do in there. So with that, I'll probably hand over to Shannon.
Thanks, Kheeran. Hello, everyone, and thanks for giving us the time today. I'll just begin by providing about a 15-minute introduction to Dataspaces before handing over to the others. It is a big topic, so it might feel a bit like drinking from a fire hose. please hang in there while we try to gently peel back just a few of the layers for you today. And obviously there's resources available in subsequent conversations that we can have. Next slide, Mohammed. So as you'd be aware, fundamentally there's a tension between the value gained by sharing sensitive data and the need to protect it. Note that today we're talking about sensitive data, and as you are aware, given the group, there's many categories of sensitive data and reasons for why it is to be treated as sensitive data. So to be clear up front, we're not advocating that Dataspaces should be adopted for the purposes of sharing open data, but if you do have Dataspaces infrastructure already in place, then they of course can be used to share open data as well as sensitive data.
Food not ready yesterday.
Note, just heading on, so note also that the design of Dataspaces reflects a growing need globally for what the Europeans call data sovereignty. It's not a very common term used in Australia, and in the first instance for organisations, but the capacity for individuals too is under active development by both the ARDC and others, and it's already implemented in other initiatives. So data sovereignty is the ability of a natural legal person to exclusively and sovereignly decide concerning the usage of data as an economic asset. And from this, Dataspaces reflects the fact that data subjects or controllers that are opinionated, that is, they must be able to control how their data is accessed and used, even after it's been shared. There's a range of Dataspace elements aimed at enabling data sovereignty, both for its own value, but also as a pathway to improve the sharing of sensitive data for the broader economic and social good. Next slide, please, Mohammed. So what situation are we trying to improve with Dataspaces? If we go back to the 1990s, I won't take you too far back for too long, there was a lot of effort spent solving the challenge of data management within organisations. So how best to internalise the data that's needed and how it should be arranged. And so next came the view of ensuring data supplies, often hardwiring in agreements and data connections in rather heavy and static ways, one step back and one step forward for whatever organisation you're working for. More recently, we've moved on to portals and platforms. These are national, typically aggregations of data sets of value that multiple organisations might draw value from. It's not the only pattern, obviously, that's in place, but it remains pretty pervasive in terms of national data sharing initiatives. Partly it looks familiar and efficient from a technology point of view, and also there's benefits in terms of the burden of data integration is lifted from most participants, obviously not the aggregator. There are some major drawbacks, so typically a very high level of anxiety in terms of providing sensitive data and then allowing someone else to make sharing decisions on our behalf. To reduce these anxieties, likely with every provider, they want an ironclad data sharing agreement. It's not a contract that's legally binding typically, it's more of a sort of informal agreement. To reduce costs, the aggregator will often want a single standard data sharing agreement with all providers and users. And as many of you will know, negotiating one of these between any more than a few partners is what I like to describe as a lifestyle, not an outcome. It can be very fraught at times. Critically, these approaches often prove to be very inflexible if you want to extend out to other use cases, often requiring a new platform, building a whole new agreement, frameworks from the ground up for that additional data set or data sets. And lastly, given the bespoke nature of each aggregation, they themselves rarely interoperate very easily. And so you might have a data set in terms of environmental data and health data, and trying to find out the environmental impacts on health can be tricky. In response to address these and other issues, the next stage of development that you can see on the screen there is that complements rather than replaces those earlier stages, is to decouple the need for every platform to create their own bespoke, trusted data supply chain infrastructure. So we don't need to rebuild entire city's transport network every time we build a new theatre or we put on a new show at a theatre, so we shouldn't have to do the same with data supply chains is the intention. And Dataspaces represent a reusable underlying infrastructure that enables the flow of data to points of potential value creation, such as in platforms or portals, but only in trusted ways as defined by each data controller. Next slide, Mohammed. So in terms of where Dataspaces came from, just a brief potted history. So the lineage of the current approach to Dataspaces as a term can be traced back to around about 2005, but sort of took off amongst the informatics community around 2010. But of course, this relies on many earlier developments. Critically, in 2015, Germany's Federal Ministry of Education and Research started funding research projects on the secure and sovereign exchange of data in the private sector. And this led to the Fraunhofer Institute establishing what was then called the Industrial Dataspace Initiative that aimed to develop a common reference architecture. And to facilitate this, they created a user association of major industrial companies to facilitate development. That association became what is now known as the International Dataspaces Association, a not-for-profit organisation based in Germany promoting and supporting the adoption of dataspaces. And the ARDC became a member of the International Dataspaces Association, or IDSA, in January of 2023. Excuse me. In 2020, the EU adopted the concept of dataspaces in their EU data strategy. They defined 9 data spaces that they were looking to develop, so across health, mobility and energy, for example. And crucially, they defined that these individual data spaces should themselves be interoperable as a single common data of where data spaces were looked at for broader adoption as a concept. To drive implementation, the EU's established the Dataspaces Support Centre, the DSSC, and that consortium includes a number of expert consortiums, including the IDSA, for example. In 2021, the Federal Ministry of Education and Research again provided funding, this time for what they call the FAIR data space, and this was integrating infrastructure between their national research data infrastructure in FBI facilities, so NCRIS equivalent. And finally, for the purpose of today, in 2023, the Dataspaces approach was adopted by the European Open Science Cloud as the approach they'll be taking. So hopefully that's provided some background in developments and where we are today. The next slide. In terms of the definition of the data space, it's an interoperable framework based on common governance principles, standards, practices, and enabling services that enable trusted data transactions between participants. You will see a number of slightly different definitions that have been used over time and are useful in different contexts when explaining data spaces. That's the one provided by the Dataspaces Support Centre, but as I said, there are many. So this definition includes several elements. First, there's interoperability. So to share data, participants in a data space need to ensure they're technically, semantically, legally, and other aspects interoperable. The data space provides common governance principles, standards, practices, and enabling services. And as you'll see later, they are bundled into what's called a rulebook or governance framework. Services are also important, and some of the other speakers will cover those services. All kinds of services are needed to form these frameworks, such as identifying and onboarding participants or making data findable. Each participant also needs services to connect their own data sources with the data space and vice versa. Finally, the element of trust is crucial. Trust enables participants to make informed decisions about how, when, and with whom to share data. Next slide, please, Mohammed. So what are the key components of data spaces? They call this a magic triangle. It's not actually, there's no magic involved. It's just a triangle. So remember that work on data spaces started with the development of a common reference architecture model. They're just about to release what they call RAM version 5. So that's on the way. There's a common set of building blocks covering aspects of business, legal, operational, functional, and technical. The IDSA also sponsors a third-party certification scheme to ensure key trust elements are validated independently and not just asserted by individual parties. And that can be compared with some of the approaches taken in Australia, and I'm happy to talk about that outside of this presentation. Lastly, as mentioned, is a rule book for each data space that, as the name suggests, describe the rules all participants agree to follow when they join, typically a consortium that establishes a data space. At the highest level, it's standardised, but with lower levels able to adopt or adapt to specific contexts. Next slide. One of the key innovations of Dataspaces is the agreements framework, and I'll just to demonstrate how some of that works, I'll go over some of the detail and contrast it to what arguably is very common in Australia, where we try to have a single data sharing agreement that covers a whole range of facets. In government, it might, for example, be an MOU. Actually, the approach the Dataspaces has taken reflects a framework that was developed up until 2014 by the Commonwealth's Australian Government Information Management Office, or AGIMO, which some of you may remember or are involved with. The AGIMO called it the National Collaboration Framework. It consisted of 5 tiers that graduated the collaborative agreements between different parties, and the idea was to enable improved service delivery nationally in collaboration with jurisdictional partners. So I just wanted to point out that it's, there's some things which are very familiar in terms of Dataspaces. And for example, this National Collaboration Framework was something which was developed in Australia, but not well implemented or well adopted, perhaps. Next slide. So in terms of the Dataspaces approach, you can see here that at the highest level, the 30,000 feet level, is the ecosystem. This is the context in which the system of systems that are Dataspaces exist. For the Europeans, it includes such things as the GDPR, but more recently, the Data Governance Act, the data strategy, for example, and all the surrounding context around that. For example, they heavily emphasise the automotive industry, which is important, particularly to Germany, but also others. But that in Australia, that would look slightly differently. So we have to be cognizant of that and start to think about how that might be, how we might have to adapt to our differing circumstances. In terms of Dataspaces, there's a number of schemes. IDSA is one scheme, but there's the potential for other schemes. GaiaX is another name that you might run across, or Big Data Value Association. Potentially these could be all different schemes. The idea would hopefully be that they all point back to a common international standard so that they remain interoperable. The iShare Trust framework does explain how schemes can work and how they should be structured. If we go down to the data space level, so there'd be typically 2 or more data spaces within a scheme. These data spaces have a membership agreement, they have an ascension agreement, so if new partners want to come on board, and they express collectively the agreements through the rulebook. A later development is actually seeing use cases within Dataspaces. So it used to be a one-to-one when initially establishing them years ago, but now it's a one-to-many use case. Use cases are just vehicles in which value is created. So for example, the automotive industry, it might be, I don't know, the carbon accounting system, or it might be the battery passport for recycling and waste system, or the construction of cars and their distribution to sales, for example, and the other use cases. These use cases are proving important because what you can do is actually graduate access based on the use case. So for example, you might offer data that you're willing to share with others, but you might constrain even the visibility of the metadata or the office available to particular use cases. You might do that, for example, that the data was collected for a specific purpose and it only lines up with the purpose of 1 or 2 use cases, but not others. So that gives us a granularity of control right from the start. Contracts we'll go over. Contracts are legal contracts. Legally enforceable contracts is the intention. within Dataspaces. They're also smart contracts and machine readable contracts based on model policy clauses, and we'll go over some of those later in the presentation. And lastly, obviously, licenses and terms and conditions, which you'll be familiar with. Next slide. So obviously today we can't go into every detail of all aspects of Dataspaces. So just briefly, let's look at some of the 21 policy classes that IDSA has already developed. So these are the things that would be made during the negotiation between the data provider and the data consumer and embedded within the digital contract that's signed by both parties. It's then enforced at a technical level with the intention that the Dataspaces is trying to move technical enforcement further to the right, but noting that there'll likely always be organisational legal enforcement as some element of that. Many of those clauses you'll see there are very familiar to you. For example, similar clauses are used or classes are used in academic publishing. For example, you might embargo data for a period. You might define how many times a data set can be accessed or used, what system the data set might be able to travel to or through, and what happens when you've finished using the data. For example, do you have to delete it? Really, it's this holistic approach and integration of a comprehensive range of known socio-technical aspects and functions that represent the real value of Dataspaces. So the way that they've tied a bunch of existing capabilities and functions together in an integrated manner to serve the purposes of improved sharing of sensitive data. Next slide. So in terms of where to next, so in Europe, as described, the Dataspaces Support Centre, in collaboration with a number of other schemes and consortiums, are driving adoption through their data strategy and their broader digital economy strategy. For its part, the IDSA has consolidated and matured Dataspaces over the last 4 to 5 years and is now focused on ensuring how Dataspaces are developing 2 ways, mainly internationalising the adoption of Dataspaces beyond Europe, because many data supply chains go outside of Europe, obviously. And the second one is ensuring that Dataspaces themselves can talk to each other, and that's being achieved largely through standardisation. You can see there's some sort of example numbers of the adoption that's going on. Next slide. So this is the last slide I've got today, and it just talks about that standardisation effort. So in addition to the range of key documents, and there's a lot of them on every aspect of Dataspaces that they're continuing to iterate, there's a large number of technical standards and business standards being developed. For example, I'm a member of the working group developing ISO 20151, and that's part of the JTC1 SC38 in the top right there. More broadly, there's a lot of work going on in terms of academic research. So there's outstanding research questions that need to be worked. And I would hope to see that in the future, should we broadly adopt the Dataspace capability, there are some important research questions to be asked in terms of what Dataspaces looks like relative to the existing context within Australia. Whirlwind tour of Dataspaces. Hopefully that answers at least some of your questions. I'm happy to hand over to John for the next section.
Thanks, Shannon. So I'm just going to say a few words around the architectures of Dataspaces. And by that we mean the actual components that go together to create a dataspace, components that implement the various functions a dataspace provides, how they interact, and how they sort of work together to create that overall dataspace service. So I thought I'd start with a definition that one of the publications from the Dataspace Support Centre put out. So they, they ask the question, or they answer the question, when is something actually a dataspace? So when can we point to something and say that's a dataspace? And And in that context, or from their publication, it's the point at which, you know, once a group of people get together, agree they need to share some data, and then actually put together a governance framework around the data space. That's actually the beginning of an actual data space. So that's, in some sense, then that's the key architectural component, is a governance framework itself. And that's sort of what I guess distinguishes a data space, is there's this explicit set of rules, explicit agreements around how data is shared and how it's managed within the data space. It actually makes it a data space. And then obviously there's people involved in sharing the data. So the other key component is that there's a governance authority there. So someone who is tasked with developing that framework, implementing that framework, and managing the data space that it defines. But if we start from a governance framework defining how the data space will operate, and all the other architectural components and concepts that build out from that are then the actual implementation, actual realisation of what's expressed in that framework. Next slide, please, Mohammed. So the Data Space Support Centre also has published what they call a Data Space Blueprint. So this is a very high level set of building blocks, if you like, around sort of defining and describing what the key components are that a data space can be built from. So this is quite a comprehensive set of tools, and behind each of these there's a set of specifications for how each of these tools will work. In this table, it's really just grouping these tools into categories in terms of whether they address business and organisational aspects of the data space, whether they address technical aspects. At this level, there's no real discussion of what the interactions of those components are. So it's really more of a, as I say, more of a toolkit than strictly an architecture, but it begins to shape up and describe more comprehensively what each of the components, what each of the functions in a data space are. So just to highlight a few of them, obviously there's a lot of components in here that are influenced by the governance frameworks. We've got things like participation management, how members of the data space are onboarded, what agreements they have to sign up to be part of the data space. We've got things like data, I'm just looking down, data services, so down the bottom right, the actual data services. There's only one component of the data space in terms of the actual technical components that actually exchange the data, only one part of that technical space. There's many other components that are around it, establishing or maintaining that level of trust. So things like identity management, things like access and usage policy controls, and so on. But this sort of top level blueprint is backed up by quite extensive specifications of each of these components and how they'd work. Next slide, please, Mohammed. So coming down a level, Shannon's already talked fairly extensively about the IDSA. So one of the key artifacts the IDSA put out is this reference architecture. So in a technical context or a systems context, the reference architecture is a very high level sort of conceptual description of the functions within the system. So it doesn't, at this level, we're not going down to specific pieces of software or specific tools or versions of libraries or anything like that. At this level, the reference architecture is describing sort of the key functions or the critical functions within the data space. But in particular, it's presenting those functions from the perspective of which layer in the data space are addressing. So at the top level, we've got business objectives. So there might be business functions around realising a particular business objective or realising a particular agreement for data sharing between two parties. As you work our way down that layer, we've got functions which actually deal with the processing of that data. And right down the bottom, we've got the actual technical system. So in terms of specific technical components, pieces of software, networks, and that sort of stuff down the bottom. But critical to the data spaces context, all these multiple layers of the data space system are tied together and at every level address those key aspects of how a data space works around security, certification and governance. So this is just obviously a really high level sort of picture of what the IDSA reference architecture looks like. It's quite an extensive piece of work, backed up by a lot of specifications, backed up by a lot of description how these components work. But just to show the overall top level picture of how a data space is structured, this is a good place to start. So go to the next slide, please, Mohammed. So as I said, the IDSA RAM is quite a comprehensive piece of work. The IDSA also publish what they call a minimum viable data space, which in some sense is like a core set of functions from the RAM. It's a very cut down picture of what a data space, how a data space is built, and what the key components are. So in this context, the minimum viable data space consists of a couple of connectors, which are essentially the data exchange mechanisms for data within the data space. But the key thing with the connectors is that they're an active service that sort of actively enforce or implement all the data sharing constraints and rules that are contained in that top level data governance framework. So on one side, we've got the broker, which is essentially a data catalog. So that's where a user can go and seek out the particular data they're interested in accessing. But then on the other side, we've got the DAPS, which is the data access. I've lost the acronym, but it's about actually implementing those data agreements at the granularity of the individual data exchanges. So if a user goes to, if a data space participant goes to the broker, determines, identifies some data they'd like to access, then the actual interactions with each connector are checked off against the DAPS to ensure that those accesses are in line with the top level data governance framework and all the rules that stipulates around how the data is to be shared. At the bottom, there's a certificate authority, which is around sort of providing a level of authentication or a level of assurance around the components within the system. So it's not about identifying people, it's about identifying the components, the software, the services that are operating in the data space. But taken together, those 5 pieces, or one or more, including one or more connectors, are what the IDSA define as a minimum viable data space. So that's a blueprint for what the technical components, the actual implementation components that are needed at a minimum to create an operating data space. We'll go to the last slide, please, or the next slide, please, Mohammed. So coming down one layer again, the IDSA has also created or supported the development of a piece of software or software suite called the IDSA testbed. So effectively what this is a reference implementation of that minimum viable data space. So it's a set of software components that conform to the specifications of each of those components identified in the minimum viable data space. They're quite, so to back up a bit, the intention of this testbed is to provide an environment for the development of actual production data space components. So it's a minimum sort of test harness, if you like. If a software developer or a company is in the process of building a connector, which they'd like to ensure, or they'd like to do the best effort to make sure it conforms to the IDSA standards, then they need a testbed of the other components, or a testbed of components which sort of replicate the other components that this connector would have to interact with in a real data space. So the testbed provides those simulated components. They're components that behave, look and walk and talk like an actual data space component, but they're really sort of lightweight. They're quite lightweight, and they're intended to just provide enough of a harness around a component under development to give some assurance that it's working the way it should. The testbed can also be used to create demonstrations. Obviously, each of these test components behaves like a real data space component, so they can be driven, they can be scripted, they can be interacted with. You know, in the purposes, for the purposes of testing or experimenting or just demonstrating how data space components work. I think that's it. That's me. That's sort of a rundown from the sort of top level of what the minimum sort of components, minimum sort of actual artifacts that are required to create a data space, down to yeah, just to show that there is software that can be downloaded, software that can be installed and run, that is the very start, the very sort of kernel of an operating data space. Thanks, Mohammed. And I think I'm handing back over to you now, Mohammed.
Yeah, thanks, John. So yeah, a couple of slides on how data spaces and trusted research environments can support each other, because there are discussions around how data spaces and trusted research environments can work together. So a couple of points that I have mentioned here. So I will start with the key message that both these concepts are complementary. So for example, TREs can provide security layer for handling sensitive data sets within the broader data sharing of framework that Dataspaces offers. But one of the other key component is like in terms of secure analytics, Dataspace actually sits on that data sharing infrastructure, which actually enables a data access that TREs needs to do analytics while providing that data infrastructure. This basically ensures within TREs that data can be analyzed in a very secure environment, actually, without losing the data sovereignty. And as the concept of data sovereignty has been explained by one of our team members in our previous slides. And the third point, which is a kind of key strength in data spaces, is that data spaces basically promotes interoperability across different systems, and this is by providing standardized frameworks, interfaces, protocols, and there are a lot of guidelines and documentations which are currently available where organizations can adopt those standards. And the benefit of that standardization or frameworks is that it can enable seamless integration of TREs. Different TREs can connect with the external data platforms and cloud services using that standardization concept that Dataspace is actually providing. When we talk about interoperability, then Dataspace can connect multiple TREs. For example, we have a concept of Dataspace connectors, which John has actually explained in Dataspace architecture. So what happens is that connectors basically connect different TREs to secure external data sources while respecting the data governance rules that have been set by the different parties. So I will show more in detail kind of an overview in the next slide. But before going ahead, the last thing is in terms of use cases. We have seen that TREs are often used in the healthcare research or in the other domains where we actually require strict or sensitive data requirements. Whereas Dataspace actually support cross-sector data sharing, and it provides an opportunity to access data across different sectors, which includes industries and research domains, and it supports a wide range of use cases. So again, the summary is both these concepts are complementing each other. As Shannon previously said, that we are not saying that Dataspaces will replace TREs or TREs will replace Dataspaces. Both can complement and support each other in different ways. So this is a second diagram of high-level overview of how Dataspaces and TREs can support each other. So on one side, we have drawn a diagram of which are the components that Dataspaces can offer. And on the right side, we actually provide a link on how Dataspace components can provide support to the TREs environments. So there are three components that are being listed here on the left side. For example, in terms of data discoverability, Dataspaces basically helps to make the data sets discoverable and accessible. So when we talk about accessibility, basically Dataspaces provide more controlled accessibility And it gives a freedom to data owners to enforce data usage policies. And once that data is being made available, that data can be used in TREs for secure analytics, for example, for processing the data and for using the data for predictive analytics. And there are a lot of applications across federated learning and collaborations nowadays, and also to extract the data insights that are being coming from the data actually. So one of the key purposes of enforcing data policies is to retain data control, to give data owners that ability to control data, even that data is being shared. And how we are doing is by using that RDS usage policy classes that has been actually shown in the left side in the yellow boxes. And Shannon actually also have given that overview of what are the IDSA policy classes and how IDS actually promotes different kind of policy classes to control the data. For example, the data owners can actually retain data control or different kind of components. For example, they can restrict their data based on the time bounds. They can allow permission based on the location. They can allow permissions for specific projects or groups. So there are 21 policy classes using which data owners can retain control and can enforce how their data can be used and can be used for different purposes. The last thing that I want to share here is like throughout this presentation, we talked about standardization and interoperability. So Dataspaces basically enables interoperability at legal, technical, and operational levels. So what actually benefits is like once we have a standardization and interoperability, it basically helps actually or connects multiple TREs. For example, on the right side of the diagram, we can see that there are 4 TREs, and all those TREs can be interconnected to each other by using a Dataspace connectors, which are standardized connectors that can be adopted by different TREs. So this is a kind of overview of how TREs and Dataspaces can work together. And for more details about ARDC Dataspaces program, I will hand over to Kheeran for the next steps.
Thanks, Mohammed. John, get on to the next slide. So as you can see, that hopefully gave you an idea of what Dataspaces are and what where it came from and how it starts to mature what we're doing. So the Australian Dataspaces program is really looking at what that red arrow is saying. How do we go from where we that centralized model that we're more familiar with here to that having an environment that we can have this federated ecosystem of Dataspaces based peer-to-peer networked ecosystem, Dataspaces, right? So the program is trying to get started on this journey and to see what we need to do. If you want to get to the next slide, Mohammed. And over the next sort of year, the idea is to gain some experience on what we need to do to adapt the IDSA some architecture and framework to Australia. Now it's international, but there are aspects of this that we need to understand when we're bringing it into the Australian context. So the legal framework in Australia is different to Europe and to other countries. So what do we need to do in there? So we're looking to do 2 pilots at this point to gain that experience, to understand what we need to contextualize to Australia, and to gain that experience of what we need to do. The other aspect of the program is we're looking at building that capacity. How do we increase the knowledge and experience within Australia about the Dataspaces to understand what that means in context of what everything else we're doing. And I see from the chat, there's a few questions around how does this relate, the trust framework in Dataspaces relates to the work that AAF is doing. These are things we need to understand, and those are the kind of things that really we need to start to look at and compare and see how that fits into the Australia idea and the intent from the IDS as well as from this program is to not reinvent the wheel where it exists, but maybe it's to align some of these things. One of the good things about, attractive things about the IDS is that it is an international standard. And because of all the work that's happening behind that, it's becoming that it's getting standardized, as you heard Shannon was talking about, that there are a number of ISO standards that are being put together as part of the IDS, and is drawing on a lot of the existing ones. So it's not about reinventing things, it's about aligning things. And then if we are already doing things that are pretty close to what IDS provides, then maybe it's about, you know, aligning that one so that in the future it matures and can be compliant with those international standards. So this time here, these couple of hours is really about that knowledge sharing experience and building the capacity. We're also looking at what kind of some training that we can pull together, and what are the opportunities for knowledge sharing and community building, that communities of interest at this point. The third stream of work that we're looking at under the program is looking at what the supporting services and capabilities might need to be. So as you saw from the architecture, there are a number of components, like there's a data catalog, there's a vocabulary ones, there's the access and the dynamic attributes. So do we need to have some of these ones as underlying capabilities and infrastructure that we need to that people can really use and makes it easier to start to build data spaces? So we're looking at what that needs to be. And the other one is the certification side of it. That's one of the key components, I think, in this space. Is it's not an assertion of what we're doing, but it's that certification that gives that verification that things are as they're meant to be, and therefore starts to build the trust in somebody who doesn't know the partner as well, to trust that that's built to a certain standard, and therefore it's safe to start using and sharing the data, and trusting that to share the data and enforce those rules I wanted to have against the data. And the fourth element is we call the shaping the landscape, and that's as Shannon highlighted in the beginning, that there are a lot of thesis around that governance and the policy and setting that up, and some of those things in Australia not quite as mature or in the same model as is needed to have this data sharing in this way that we can scale up and have the more sovereign data control is in there. So there's lots of work that has happened that has not quite matured or has fallen, have been parked. So part of the fourth trade is to saying, what are things that we can do to improve that institutional arrangements, and therefore the agreements frameworks, the policy frameworks, and what's the gap between what's in place and what we need to have, and what can we do to influence that. So I think having these conversations with maybe places like the ARDC and some of the federal government agencies that are in positions to start to help improve that. So those are the four streams of work the program's trying to do over the next sort of year, and then leading into the future, what we need to do to continue those on. Next slide, please, Mohammed. So hopefully that gave you a fairly quick whirlwind of a very, very big topic. And I would really like to keep in touch and keep you informed. So there is that's the website that up on the page there for the Dataspaces. That's got a fair bit of additional information. There's some FAQs and questions, and which we'll keep updating as we go. But also there's a link there to register interest, and there's a mailing list that and is maintaining, which we're hoping to use to both communicate what we're trying to do and to keep you informed of this, and to really get that community going around that. So with that, I will stop. It's probably the end of our presentation part, and open it up for questions.